Hi, everybody. Welcome. Gerondo Alex Filler here. And I want to welcome you to another series of Leading in the Moment. It's a live series streamed on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube on the second and fourth Wednesday of every month, starting at 2 p.m. Pacific and 5 p.m. Eastern. Um, so, very excited to have you here to talk about a topic that can be very challenging, but with consistency and measurement and work, it really can become something that is um, easier and just much more manageable over time. So, that topic is true accountability and what that looks like in psychologically safe spaces. It looks different depending on where you are, but it's achievable. Honestly, it's achievable by a lot of different people. So if you've joined me before, um, you know that I ask a question before we get started on the topic. But before I do that, if you are joining and tuning in live, please put live in the chat. If you're watching the replay, you can also put replay in the chat. So the question of the day, I was actually asked this question earlier today, and I was thinking about it for a while, but now I have a good answer for it, at least a good answer for me. But the question that I really want to ask is, if you could be in a TV show or a movie, which one would you be in and why? So if you were to be in a TV show or a movie, which one would you be in and why? So for me, I love action movies so much. It's kind of like action and like crime thrillers, which I really got to stop watching too many crime thrillers because then I just can't sleep. But then it feels worth it because it's just like the adrenaline that you get from it. But I digress. I would love to be in a Mission Impossible movie. So if you don't know the Mission Impossible franchise, Tom Cruise is in it, and there's many different movies, series that go forward. There's a new one that just came out, and it's an action movie. He's an agent that essentially has a small team of people who have different skill sets, and they can go and they save the world. But I just love the action that goes in it. So if I could be in a Mission Impossible movie and I could like jump out of a plane or jump from a motorcycle into a car or just drive a car through a bunch of traffic and try to capture the bad guy, like that would be so awesome to me. I'd be horrified. It'd be really scary. I probably need a lot of training, but it would be so much fun. Oh, it would be so much fun. So if you're tuning in live and you want to give your answer to the movie or TV show you would love to be in and why, I'd love to see your answers to that in the chat. And if we have time, I'd also love to get to them. Okay, so going back to the topic of what true accountability ability looks like for psychologically safe spaces. Now, I want to start off by defining what does true accountability mean and what does it look like. So true accountability is you're essentially willing and committed to um, whether it's you or individual as an individual or groups to take responsibility for your actions, your decisions, and outcomes. And there's a lot of decisions and outcomes that us as leaders have to decide on, things that are going to happen that may be reflected on us and our team. But it's really more than just admitting that you've made a mistake. It's really taking that acknowledgement um, of your obligations, delivering on your commitment, and just being willing to answer to the impact that your behavior may have on other people. And I want to share an example of this because I was in an experience like this, and it can be really, really hard to try to take accountability because your intentions may not be what you would hope for them to be, but also it may be hard for some people to just relinquish that control and admit that they're wrong. Um, for me, I felt terrible, and what happened was I was having a conversation with a former colleague that I used to work with, and I had some kind of ill feelings from something that happened in the past. It was not an experience that was great, um, but it happened many years ago, and I was still salty about it. Why, I don't know, but I kind of brought it up and kind of just word dumped and blamed my experience on them and blamed a lot of things on them. And they had put me in my place to say, this, what essentially happened, there were things that you could have done differently, that it could have gone better. And the fact that you are kind of using me as a scapegoat to say that I'm the reason for that experience just is not fair and it's not right. And so I was really glad that that happened, because then I really was like, oh, let me take accountability for how I made you feel, how I put you in a place that you shouldn't have been in. And let me know that like my obligation to you was really to just connect and network and support you in your next job search. And I just took it upon myself to do something that was just not right and not fair. So I wanted to deliver on that. I wanted to express my behaviors, the impact I had on that person, and I took accountability for it. I admitted I made a mistake. I admitted that my actions had a really big impact. And we went on and had a very great conversation. And there was a lot of vulnerability in the conversation that really built a strong relationship, which I very much appreciated. And so again, it really goes beyond making those mistakes. It's really trying to approach things proactively and rectify your errors, learn from your experiences, and work towards solutions on improvement. And so for me, I know that if I'm going to get emotional about something, I need to take a step back and say, I just need a moment. And maybe I need to pause the camera, reschedule, do something because that brought up a lot of emotion for me. And the way I addressed it was just not cool. So I like to go through the definition of that first because it's helpful to frame what true accountability means, because it also involves transparency and integrity and your genuine commitment to upholding your standards and your values and responsibilities, not only in your professional life or in an organizational context, but personally. And the more that you do it, the more practice that you have with it, the easier it's going to get for you. Again, if you're still with me, put live in the chat. If you're watching the recording, put recording when you have a moment. We are talking about what true accountability looks like for psychologically safe spaces. Now, there are many challenges that come with really trying to be as, or trying to hold yourself accountable, or maybe you're not holding yourself accountable, but maybe you're trying to hold others accountable. And the response is going to be different depending on where the person is. Now, the challenge of getting to true accountability is you have to be willing and open to talk about your mistakes. And if you're in a culture where people don't feel comfortable acknowledging their mistakes, or there's fear in people having an open and vulnerable conversation about errors, that is where you're going to lack true accountability. And what this could look like is somebody goes and you're in a meeting, a leader wants to ask for others' opinions on an idea or a topic. And there's been a trend that no matter what the team says, their ideas are not usually implemented. People are not taken seriously. And it's been evidenced in engagement surveys or private conversations in many multiple avenues and ways, but it's never been addressed. So there's a fear now that if I say anything, what does it matter? No one's going to listen to me. Or another fear that comes with this is if I admit a mistake, my job will be at jeopardy. I cannot be honest about it. And the environment that leaders create can create those types of spaces. And if they're not held accountable based on what people are sharing, people are saying, also silence tells a lot too. If you're not hearing much from your team, or other people are not hearing a lot from your team, it could be potentially an indication that something deeper is happening and they're just not willing or able to voice it. It's also really hard to take responsibility for your own actions and take ownership in it. I know for me, I'm a very anxious person. So when I do something wrong, I immediately default to, oh, this is terrible. I did something awful. I will either like lose this person or get fired or this is going to go awful. And it's not ever as bad as it seems. Um, but I do have to recognize my contribution and rectify that there are negative consequences to some things that happen, but we can work together and learn from them. But we have to take responsibility. I remember one time, it was awful. I worked in an organization where a huge mistake happened in a room full of, I think it was 5 or 6 people. My manager threw me under the bus and said it was my fault. And it was not even my fault. I wasn't even involved in the project. So you can imagine how I felt. And when I approached them, I said, "Why did you say that it was me?" And they said, "Well, I didn't want myself to be seen any differently, and you were new, and so maybe people could see that you're newer and it wouldn't be as bad on you." I'm like, "Well, now it is a reflection on me." Um, and you can imagine how that relationship went and how psychologically safe I felt in that experience. And what's the last thing that's pretty hard is active listening and respectful feedback, wanting to truthfully hear feedback. A lot of times we don't want to hear feedback from other people, but we'll ask for it just to say we did. But where accountability comes in is tracking that feedback through things like one-on-one check-ins and performance metrics that are in a platform, in some type of a system where it's visible. And I know that there's some things that may be private or may be confidential in conversations that you're having amongst your manager, your peers, your leaders, but it's still just as important to be able to track that over time. You don't have to include confidential conversations, but if you have a conversation about performance, or a conversation where you gave feedback, it's okay for that person to say, "Thank you for taking my feedback," and having it documented somewhere. It's also okay to say to other people, or have there be essentially an accountability partner where you talk about the feedback that you've received, how it feels, what you're going to do about it, and have them check in with you over time. This is really, really hard in an environment where you don't have psychological safety at the forefront. You don't have leadership, especially your executive team, saying or modeling that it's okay to be vulnerable and admit your mistakes and work to work through it together, and that it's not going to jeopardize your job. And this is probably the most important time for this. I always think it's important regardless, but because we're, especially in the United States and other parts of the world, and I won't get political, um, people want to keep their jobs because they cannot afford to lose their jobs in the state of the economy and where it is right now, or other things that are happening across the world. So being able to start to do this is so important. And learning and orienting, having a growth mindset to this. I think that sometimes we go to our feelings and then a lot of emotionality comes in. So when we get feedback or we're held accountable to something to say, this is what we have set as expectations. You may not be meeting these expectations, especially providing an inclusive environment. We get defensive and we start thinking of a fixed mindset where we can't change this. This is how we've done things. Um, you start to blame other people instead of focusing on that accountability for yourself. So, how do you achieve this? Now, if you're still with me, put live in the chat if you're here with me live. If you're watching the replay, please put replay. But how do we hold someone accountable to create more psychologically safe spaces? One is demonstrating that inclusive behavior. It's the expectation setting, but you have to be clear in defining the expectations. Just by saying you need to be inclusive with your team, that is not very clear. It's I've noticed that when we are in team meetings, you do tend to interrupt people. My expectation for you is to allow other people to speak and be heard. Very specific, very different, very clear. And it's respecting those diverse experiences, being very open minded. And when it comes to another thing about inclusive behaviors is observations and feedback, like I was talking about. Giving feedback on observed behaviors. Now, you have to kind of provide a space to get more feedback from your teams. What that looks like is maybe there's a survey or focus groups or forums where you can assign people that are not on your team to collect the information and share it with you. And if people don't feel like they're getting enough feedback, or they've given you feedback and you haven't addressed the actions, it's really, really critical that you start to be open minded to this and take it very seriously. And there's also ways that you can evaluate this during team meetings. It's actions like, is someone always talking over another person? Are people being are people actually being collaborative? Are people creating more inclusive guidelines for meetings where those who don't usually get a chance to speak and talk now have the opportunity to do so? So it's different things to encourage those inclusive behaviors. Another is open communication. Open communication, honestly, uh, it does take practice, but when you have platforms or forums for people to voice their concerns and their suggestions and their thoughts, and encourage people to participate in meetings or anonymous feedback channels, that is a good way to start building that. So I've seen really great examples of this where there's an anonymous feedback form and it's a Google form or some type of a survey form where people can anonymously share feedback on something that they've noticed, something that they're not ready to pinpoint of who it was. And maybe they do pinpoint who it is, but it's at least anonymous. So we can start to slowly build that up. And if you see trends in that, that's another great way for accountability. So address that very soon, much sooner than you think that you would address it. Because it's really critically important that you do that sooner rather than later. And follow up on any of those types of conversations. But what's really important here is actively listening. A lot of people really think like, oh, I know exactly what that is. I know active listening. I got this down. Active listening, honestly, is really validating the other person and encouraging meaningful conversation and trying really hard not to think about what you want to say and actually speaking back to the person. So if someone says to you, I'm really starting to feel like I'm not getting included in meetings, I'm always being talked over, it's repeating back to the person to say, what I'm hearing is that you don't feel that you're being heard in meetings. Other people are always talking over you, and you don't have a way to share your voice and your experiences. Totally different experience than, oh, yeah, that sounds good. No, it doesn't sound good that people are talking over me, but you feel heard in that way. The biggest piece here, and this is the last point that we'll talk about, is role modeling and leadership. Why I always say it's very important to have psychological safety start from the top and trickle its way down is because of the example that the leadership wants to set for the organization, to then set the expectations on their leaders, and then be able to take that and set the expectation for others across the organization. And when you have that clear directive, it makes it so much easier, with some challenges still, to lead by example, lead by the behaviors you want to see, and then you could measure these in things like performance reviews. You can measure whether people feel that they're being heard. You can do this in engagement surveys. You can also be able to look at the engagement surveys and decide, are we seeing and capturing themes in this one particular team, department, manager, wherever, and look at the data that you have available to you. And also just offering some training on what good looks like for psychological safety, what your expectations are, and what accountability is going to look like. And that coming from the top and trickling down to the bottom. I don't like to say bottom, but trickling down throughout the organization. Because those are really big indicators of psychological safety when people are aware of what psychological safety means, what role modeling behavior actually looks like, being able to measure what good looks like and where there's still opportunities, but then being able to set those expectations and holding people accountable, which is the hardest thing that happens here. because there's sometimes fear of, I don't want to have conflict with my team. I don't want to make this person upset. They're my top performer and I don't want them to leave if I give them this type of feedback. Now, you might lose a top performer, but losing one person over an entire department or an entire team, which I've seen happen before, um, has a much greater impact. It would and is something that could be easily prevented by modeling this right behavior. So, all in all, summary of what we talked about today are to achieve true accountability, you have to understand what makes it challenging or the reasons why people do not want to be held accountable and address those. Being vulnerable as a leader to share your mistakes, things that you don't know, genuinely asking for folks' feedback, really listening to the feedback that you're getting and implementing it, and the executive team and leaders modeling the behavior that they want to see and continuously modeling that behavior and evaluating through those different metrics that we talk about. So, thank you so much for your time. I'm Geronda Wallach Spiller. This is Leading in the Moment with Geronda. I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you also for answering the question of the day. And the next series that is going to take place is going to be on December 27th, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. I know that's a little bit after the holiday, around the holiday, so most people may not be available, but these are recorded, and I will make sure that you all have the recording. So thank you so much again for joining. I hope you have a great evening, great afternoon, wherever you're tuning in, and I will see you next time. Have a great one, everybody.